Thanks a lot for the chairs and the opportunity to speak here. So we've heard a lot of spaces. We seen lots of spaces that have been in fact rooms, and many landscapes or landscape sceneries that are in fact spaces. I'm super happy, Sam, that you mentioned the importance of thresholds for like a sequence of spaces and the space of a wall itself. Maybe we could start with the idea that Jan-Peter Wingeder brought in, and the question whether spaces and typology match, or if the idea of typology could help us through or help us out of this like kind of mixed up unclarity about what space is. Could you see something like that, that there is like a typology of spaces that could like sort it to several functions or something like that?
Me?
Why not you? Yeah.
I think it's when you see a building that doesn't do this well, you realise that there's a kind of reciprocity between rooms that I think is the result of an understanding of typology. So that you appreciate that there is continuity. So again, that threshold, it's not an arbitrary condition. But yeah, I mean, I suppose it's that thing of the wholeness of a plan, isn't it? And then a plan has a figure or a shape. The phrase type form, there is recognizable structure to the whole as well as the parts. Does that perhaps begin to answer the question?
Yeah, that's all right. That's all right. Jasper, would you go on?
Do you want me to answer the question? No, I'm happy to.
Yeah.
Because I actually wanted to pretty much ask the same thing. Because that question of like type or maybe typicality, as Peter Carter put it, or so the whole question of like, if you talk about spaces, in which way, or are they related to previous experience of space, is also something that you could say, or like typical solutions, like so finished spaces that are already like fully designed, and how can you relate like what you're trying to find out as something that is latent? You know, how is that related to? I mean, it must be related to some kind of preconceived picture, or else, I mean, how, you know, where would the latency come from? It's not something that you can just like see into things without having some kind of resemblance with previous experience. So I think that, but then, I mean, if we look at some of the architectures that we've seen today, they're obviously without precedence. I mean, and you couldn't really say, you know, if I look at what Tayo showed, that's probably not something where you'll find a lot of typology. I mean, apart from the fact that it makes use of pre-existing buildings that are maybe typical in a way, but the result certainly isn't.
What about the others?
No, just say something sensible.
Just keep it rolling. It is, yeah.
Well, I like the idea, what you said, that the conception of space is also about what you have experienced before, or what kind of memory you have. Once you visited a space that was, well, had its own quality, and in that sense, every time you work on a new building, there is a new preoccupation, een verwachtung. Ik weet niet if that's a German word, expectation. And it can be in a few seconds that you already feel what kind of expectation you want to make there, but then it's hard work to grasp it and to work on it, that it becomes an architectonical space, or that you can reproduce it and find out what kind of typology or what kind of precedents there are that helps you to organize it, or that helps you to make it more rich even. Yeah, so I really like this idea that makes it also a very personal profession in that way.
So is that the moment when, like, the expectation you as planners have for the spaces or for the rooms match with the way people use it, becomes good architecture or functioning, good working architecture? Jörg Springer?
I'm not sure. I think, well, shall we predict what kind of use people make of the space? And isn't space, in a way, isn't it independent from use? I'm quite skeptic about this idea. I think a good work of architecture should allow different kinds of use. So I should think we should try to think about something which is, well, suitable for totally different uses, yes. Das Allgemeine, I would say, in German is...
I think
prefer
you're
that.
absolutely right. I think what I've seen today, then I think generosity is one of the biggest qualities I see in all these projects, whether it's a church, a town hall, a playground, or a garden in between student flats. It's all about a kind of monumentality within the space that can use in many ways, even if there are no people. So I was very surprised by that. Yeah.
And I think it is a problem, though, isn't it? Because at least I speak from an English perspective, but I can't believe I'm alone, which is that the people who are commissioning buildings have worked out, well, they think they've worked out what they need. So what they tend to do is determine precisely what they need, which is literally spatial. But it's also, they have all sorts of preconceived ideas about what works and what doesn't. And you find yourself, I mean, literally dimensionally boxed in. And again, so finding that generosity, unlocking some additional space. But even just, I mean, I think there are certain uses which, I don't know, for example, one takes something like mental health, where inevitably there is spaces that probably are going to be harder to make work. So there's this sort of spectrum, isn't there, of space where you're liberated as an architect, and other spaces where the evidence says you've got to do it this way. But I think a 21st century problem is that so much is dictated in the brief for a building that the architect is then struggling to find a way. And then maybe that also partly because as a profession for a good chunk of the 20th century, we didn't seem to be that interested in space. We were making serviced, I mean, you have to call it space, but you were creating serviced interiors without much definition. So by this point, everything's shrunk, and now you're trying to redefine it, and you find you've got very little room for maneuver.
Okay, but then, I mean, generosity would also be a quality that you ask of a space. Maybe if we take the question away from that, idea of functionality in terms of that the space determines its use, there still remains the question, I guess, of what has also been called like ambience or atmosphere or something like that. So, in which way are the spaces that you conceive suggestive of something? I mean, in which way are they speaking of something? In which way are they asking you maybe also to behave in a specific way, which is as close as it gets to function, maybe. But I mean, if there is some kind of like architecture parlante, I mean, how much is there in space, to speak?
Tim Heider.
Yeah, clever. I think I agree to the point that there is nothing like a neutral space. I mean, we saw many examples that try to be as open as possible, maybe, but they always giving a certain condition to the space. And I think this relation between what will happen in this space or what we do make possible is a very crucial question. We always have that, the question of Großzügigkeit, sorry, is always something when we, for example, what we showed today, you really have to search for this in these projects, yeah, because it's not evident that you can have it, because it's all is sticked. You don't have more square meters than you have, and of course you relate it to the money and whatever. So there's always the question: can we give a double condition to a space that you can use it like this and this? And then you always came to the point, and that seems to be very interesting, that that even if it's meant to be a very open space, you need something which is specific in this space to really, I may say, to really give a trigger or a first move to have something happen there. And I think that's very interesting. And I'm always thinking about the conditions of the social housing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever, and they all have these gathering spaces, and they all don't work. They all don't work because they're somewhere, and it's so important. Where is this space? How is the condition of the space? How is it related? How can you adapt it? How can you put something in that is yours and not obtained by the idea of the architect, whatever, but you still need some condition that is there to trigger this situation, yeah. And I think this is a very fine line to speak about space, and it's all, of course, different. But I think we are. And even your project, the white space, no, really try to be has this kind of idea of being neutral. But then on the other hand, you said they all go in there and they were quiet, because this gives a very certain atmosphere to the space, and it's of course not at all neutral. It's a condition to give it into the space. And I think to think about that in relation, this is very important. And even for different architecture, so a lot of things we saw today we can't compare, but we can relate this to each other. I think that I want to point out this aspect at least.
I think what a space makes it so specific is its atmosphere and its materialization, of course. So when you make a town hall, which is fully clad from the inside with marble from all over the world, it's more like a Semperiaan's idea to give representation what's going on inside, and a completely different material on the other side, making the city. In your project, what really struck me is that this church is completely made of wood. The floors, the walls, the ceilings, even the light, the roof element. That makes it like a cocon, and it brings in a kind of intimacy and a feeling that you are that there is a kind of concentration with a lot of people being together for a moment, almost like a living room, more or less.
Well, I think we should separate so the types of buildings we are talking about, because those special buildings like yours or mine, the church, they have a very special purpose. And so what interests me more in this discussion are those more common buildings like yours, for example. And when I'm talking about the neutral of a building, I think for those buildings, and even an administration building is one of that kind, we should think how we can create spaces which are in a way neutral, which can persist for a very long time under changing circumstances. And so what's kept as a character of a room? What makes a room special, although it's not made for a very restricted, very limited purpose? And so then I think it's a good room. So I think, well, if we succeed to do so, it would be a lot, huh? Normally we do not. Huh?
We often use the word fondness. That you know, most buildings kind of, in many people's eyes, stop working after about 20 years because it's almost a generational thing, it seems, at least in recent generations. If a building lasts 20 or 30 years, it probably will last a lot longer.
300, we heard. 300 is the benchmark is 300.
Of what it should do.
It should do, yes.
Yeah, but most buildings don't last that long, anything like that long, and it's because we've sort of said there's no fondness for the building. So I think that would be my way of kind of articulating, which is kind of fairly loose because it's kind of very hard to explain what might engender fondness, but actually it's kind of liberating, because we can all imagine what might make somebody fond of our building, and then we use whatever means we have at our disposal. But the one thing is not that it functions, because it will stop functioning in everybody's eyes in a very short period of time.
Uwe Schröder.
Yeah, I think maybe it's a question for you. You started with the question of typology, you know, and if we are talking about typology in a spatial sense, then we should realize that typology links spaces and purpose in a way, we can say. Yeah? And so we can say the idea of a purpose and the idea of the space. So I think it is not like this that we don't have in our mind if we have a concrete task. If we don't have in mind the space, I hope we think in a first way about the space, because the space is the direct representation of a purpose, of an idea of a purpose. So I think it is one of the most important questions also in the design process. So, and I think it is not a big difference if we think about a church or if we think about an apartment house. In every case, it is this idea of typology inside, and that means that we have to establish an idea, a cultural idea of the inhabitants in a general way, I think. So but maybe we can clarify this question a little bit more.
Do you feel like you can? It leads us to the core of these 2 days. Like, are we able to clarify that?
Or contradict? It's also possible to contradict this.
Well, I'm not sure whether I fully agree with you. So maybe I would not talk about purpose, about Bestimmung. So maybe a project gives like kind of an Anlass, an opportunity to make a building. And then from that moment on, I think it would help to think about the general rather than the special. And so this may help to make buildings last longer. And so, of course, this is possible for churches as well as for apartment houses. So far, you're right.
Yeah, but you are looking, in every case, you are looking for a general solution.
Of course. Oh. So I do. I do. Not everyone does, but yes.
Is there another word for purpose? Just in case. Yeah, no, I just want to. I want a kind of another version of the word purpose, just to make sure I'm understanding the.
Well, we had this some years ago.
In every case, the purpose at the end in our thinking are the people themselves. So that is what Jürgen Hasse told us when he was talking about Heidegger. When he was talking about Heidegger, we are all inhabitants. So. And if we are talking about the purpose, we are talking about us as inhabitants. So we have to link the way we are with the spaces we want to create, in a way.
Maybe I can add a comment which will make things maybe a little bit more complicated. So I think right now in the architectural discourse there are like two narrations there at the same time. One is a critique that the built environment in architecture kind of structures systems of power. And then there's a critique, and this kind of aims towards an architecture which is more egalitarian. Maybe with this idea of the Greek polis where everybody had the same plot and the same kind of street, no matter what their social status or economic power, political power was. And then on the other side, we have this narration of a society getting more and more diverse, accepting that there are more different ways of how we live. And this narration asks for diversity. For example, when it comes to housing, for more different types of housing. And I think these are like two narrations which we might agree are both valid, but they kind of are a contradiction in themselves.
I'm not sure that it is a contradiction. We saw a very beautiful project, I think it was in Amsterdam, and they showed very precisely made apartments for very different people. And so they were more or less all the same. And so they were all the same, super carefully made. A very beautiful project. So I think there's no contradiction. But well, it shows that the conditions under which we use buildings, they change so rapidly. So we cannot foresee what will happen in 20 years even. So let's not try to.
This is for me the perfect starting that you explained now, that I just want to wonder, where is this fascination of building forever? I just wanted to ask the panel why we are focusing on making constructions forever. I will give one example. In the buildings, do we see buildings of Shigeru Ban made with the tubes, the cardboard tubes, as architecture or not? And by saying that, I really want to tackle that question of building forever, because the starting point of we are changing completely. so fast is, in my opinion, exactly the point why we have to consider that question very well. In some cases, I think the Belgian architect Bob Farreet called it intelligent ruins, built intelligent ruins. I think that's a very good, interesting quote, because he said make a certain kind of flexible buildings, but in my opinion that's incredibly interesting for certain kinds of typologies, not for all kind of architecture. So by saying or making general that we have to build forever, I just wanted to open that question to the panel. How we all agree with that? And do we see Shigeru Ban not as an architect?
Further of all, thank you so much for opening that, because it leads us maybe to the topic of responsibility for further generations and for all the phenomena we're facing right now. So,
can we just
yeah,
can we talk about that?
That?
What Joe raised. I mean, I guess there's a dimension of the the fabric that exists around us that's made, which starts to establish memory and kind of sort of anthropological, that thing of your seasonality, generation, lives lived, places made. So I think there's real virtue in things lasting, not just from an environmental point of view or because it's kind of economic, but actually because it offers continuity from one generation to the next, and possibly kind of empathy for one period of time or one group of people to another. But equally, it's not an absolute. It's definitely not an absolute necessity. But you can see all sorts of virtues in things surviving, as it were, things that are kind of a revelation because they still exist.
Ja, ich kann das nicht so gut auf Englisch sagen. Also ich kann das auch gleich nochmal versuchen zu übersetzen, aber ich finde das eine super interessante Diskussion. Ich würde dem hinzufügen ich würde gar nicht, ich glaube, es ist überhaupt nicht widersprüchlich. Ich glaube, dass Räume robust sein müssen. Das heißt für mich, dass sie eine gewisse Ausdauer haben können, aber das kann eben auch heißen, dass man sie transformierbar halten muss. Ich meine damit bestimmt nicht, dass man Wände rein und raus tut oder so. Und ich glaube, über so eine Robustheit muss man nachdenken. Das ist, finde ich, passt nicht nur zur Nachhaltigkeitsdiskussion, sondern es passt eben überhaupt zur, sagen wir mal, zu dem, was dort eben auch formuliert worden ist, nämlich zu dem Aspekt, dass eben der Wechsel und die Möglichkeiten der Anpassung einfach gesellschaftlich gegeben werden müssen. Wir können ja natürlich sagen, die Gesellschaft hat sich jetzt weitgehend ausdifferenziert und das mit den Individuellen hat sich jetzt erledigt und wir gehen jetzt in was Neues ein, aber ich glaube, das ist ein ongoing process. Und ich glaube, es ist im Übrigen auch überhaupt nicht widersprüchlich, wie man das Ziel erreicht. Also wenn man sagt, man erstellt vielleicht so einen robusten Raum, ich glaube, er müsste dann anständig groß sein, vielleicht, ja, der eben eigentlich eine Art Umwidmung gut erträgt, dann ist es auch eine Art von Robustheit und vielleicht Langlebigkeit. Und es ist überhaupt kein Widerspruch zu vielleicht eine Architektur, die ein Zerfallsdatum hat, weil man sie ständig wieder neu aufbaut, was auch eine Form von Transformation ist. Ich glaube, es ist nur wichtig, dass diese Kohärenz zum Gedanken da ist, der einfach sagt, also im Wohnungsbau ist es natürlich relativ einfach zu sagen, wer ist es, für wen mache ich das und und die gesellschaftsrelevante Frage, die damit verbunden ist. Ich glaube, das ist beim Wohnungsbau zumindest das Spezifikum, was vielleicht sich auch ein bisschen wandelt. Aber die Robustheit eines Raums, der vielleicht auch in gewisser Weise resistent sein muss, Ja, das finde ich das finde ich auch gar nicht widersprüchlich in diesen ganzen unterschiedlichen Annahmen jetzt mal zum Raum. Ich glaube, vielleicht könnten wir uns auf sowas sogar einigen. Aber es gibt natürlich unterschiedliche Methoden und es gibt vielleicht auch unterschiedliche Möglichkeiten, dieses Ziel oder diese Möglichkeiten zu erreichen. Sorry, you guys. Probably you can squeeze it to one sentence, but even this was not possible for me. Sorry.
In Dutch is robuustheid, so it's
Robust, yeah.
robust.
Yes,
Yeah.
That leads us to the question whether the space itself needs to be that much robust that we can imagine any or as much as opportunities as possible, or whether the materials could be disassembled and reassembled and something like that. But because we're talking about space, it seems to be a kind of a good solution for now. That robust spaces.
Are you talking about geometry, a robustness geometrically, or a literal robustness of surface and therefore definition of volume?
No, more like a robustness in kind of that the spaces should not be too specific, that we can imagine it to be used as something else in the future. So it also depends the construction, but also the way the space itself is like thought or dimensioned.
But doesn't that then empathy is a necessity again, because actually, space isn't really that constraining. It's only when somebody has an a priori idea of whether something functions that it stops being useful, as opposed to, almost anything can be put to use and has character. It's whether you have an attitude which is receptive to that. So I don't think you can be dogmatic about that idea.
Ich kann es leider auch nur auf Deutsch sagen. Das Beispiel Sulzer-Areal in Winterthur, das ist ein Industrieareal. Da gab es über die letzten 50 Jahre vielleicht 3-4 Mal einen Wettbewerb. Der erste Plan war, das ganze Tabula Rasa weg, neu bauen. Dann kann man darauf, vielleicht könnte man wie wir das gesehen haben, eine Fassade behalten. Dann kann man darauf, vielleicht könnte man ja sogar die Struktur behalten. Dann kann man darauf, vielleicht könnte man ja sogar das ganze Haus behalten und irgendetwas ergänzen oder rausnehmen. Was auf jeden Fall klar ist, oder ob das jetzt dauerhaft ist, robust oder aus Karton, ist, dass dieses Behalten sehr viel mehr Qualität hat als das Wegschmeißen. Immer. Oder? Und das habe ich beim HG Merz, ich bin jetzt gespannt, was Sie dazu sagen, oder diese Frage die Ästhetisierung dieses Grabens, die jegliche Qualität zerstört, ist eine Schwierigkeit beim Neubau, dass die Dinge dann einfach zu schön sind. Oder? Und darum behalten wir doch lieber all das alte Zeug und machen etwas damit.
Ja, und lassen einfach die Authentizität des Ganzen. Man muss einfach manchmal auch ein paar Lebensspuren lassen. Man muss nicht alles überfassen. Das ist mir bei meinen Sachen aufgefallen. Dann wird es einfach zu glatt. Aber ich wollte jetzt nochmal, I just want to come back to the robust, the spaces. They're robust? Okay. I think it's a question of size. And if you think a fun palace of Cedric Price, you can do everything what you want. Every day different. Maybe you can use this also for buildings, for apartments. But then you have to talk to your neighbor. And maybe then if the communication is good, you can do it or not. So it's, I think it will be fine if you can do that. If you have rooms or spaces, they can fit to everything you need. Well, it's definitely it's different from a theater or a cultural institution to an apartment or to residential buildings. But I think Mies said it once, he wants to have open spaces because he don't know what the people are really need. Everyone needs something else, a little bit. And but you should make it possible to do it. But I think this is really a question of size. You cannot do everything in an apartment of 30 square meters.
Maybe I'd like to add something about this idea of robustness or resilience. I think is another term used for it. I think we all agree that it's an ideal case if a building has this openness to be changed and to adapt to other uses, or the users can adapt it easily to the new uses, because in that case most of the structure will remain. But I was talking to an architecture office called In Situ lately, did an interview. They're based in Basel and Zurich, and they said they made a research on these robust buildings, and they figured out most of them were torn down anyhow after years. So this idea, it's a modern idea that you can have these robust structures which remain and will be adaptable, somehow did not work in so many cases. So what does it mean? I think the next step is then that we have to agree that buildings must be easily be able to deassemble, to kind of be torn down, taken apart in their pieces, but then not recycled, because also one thing we know today that recycling, for example, steel frames emit a huge amount of CO2, which we actually should try to avoid. So that would kind of lead us to the thing that buildings should be adaptable, but if they're not adaptable, they should be easily be taken apart, and these parts must then be able to be reassembled without melting them down or shredding them or whatsoever, because this uses too much energy and emits too much CO2.
This could be a good idea, and so, but you cannot plan it. You cannot do it as a first step as recycling when you're an architect. You need then energy and everything. I think the most important thing in our times is that we make buildings that that you can reuse them. It is clear, and that is our job, to create these buildings. We don't know what is tomorrow and everything, and we cannot plan recycling or something. We have to think about it, that you can renovate them and reuse them, but to plan that is not possible. And we have to, I think we have to think on an architecture that we have flexible rooms, as how big they are, how they are constructed. And that is where is Jan? There. One big problem in architecture is fire. I don't understand why people said we have to build in wood. I cannot understand. We can do buildings for that, yes, but we are here to identify architecture. In the whole area of making buildings, we make tents, we make buildings in stone and steel and paper and everything. But we have to identify what is architecture.
Dear Paul, we are at the same point again. We had it this morning. I think Crystal Palace is architecture. I think Cedric Price's Fun Palace is architecture. And I think medieval wooden structures, we had, for instance, like in the city of Frankfurt, they are very sustainable and flexible structures. And if you look at the Japanese wooden housing, it was a very flexible, robust kind of structure. It's not just to disassemble, but you easily can change parts. So it's going on, it's going on. And I think that's an idea of architecture that really doesn't say anything about the quality of space or the way it makes us fond or it goes too hard. That's a question of care, how we do it. And that's the way where we come together because of this little wooden thing at the floor and the wall coming together. I think it's and we didn't talk about this question, what makes spaces so they go too hard and they make people feel good. And this is not a question only of surface. I don't agree with Andreas because he didn't do it like that. He had structure, he had proportions. There were much more things than surfaces. And so I think we have to relate the question of space to the question of structure, and we have to relate the question of use to the question of purpose, and that even we don't have to change the kit of parts or we don't have to change the structure. We have to give the opportunity, and I think that was a wonderful part. We have to make spaces that have a good use, a good answer for the purpose, but we know the purpose will change even in little parts, a little bit of change in the way somebody will use a room without changing the windows, without changing the walls, but still there are different ways of living. And I think if we respect this, we come to the point what is really the question of form and design and the quality of care we put in doing the spaces. And typology will not answer that. Certainly we have to know about typology, but you don't come to a project and say, well, I heard about typology 5 years ago and now I choose this. That's not the way it's working. It's a research, it's a journey to design, it's a journey you don't know at the beginning where it ends. But certainly you have to have experience and you have to have knowledge about theory and about experience. But it's not that easy, I think. It's a very complicated and very complex process where things have to come together. And I think that's what makes architecture. The way it's done, the way the care is put into a project. And then we have to talk what's architecture, Paul.
Oh, there's a dimension to add to the conversation, because if you discuss architecture, I notice that very often you discuss architecture as the production of new buildings. You discuss architecture in timeless, we have to, after the Second World War, I read recently, and if it's completely true or not, I don't know, but it triggered my mind. After the Second World War, we built more square meters of built surface on this earth than in the entire history of mankind before the Second World War, which means we have an enormous stock of space available. And if you contemplate sustainability and all kind of, if we're able to take buildings apart, yes or no, or if they are there forever, it doesn't matter. We're confronted with an enormous amount of space that's all being done by our previous generations of architects, and I see a lot of young architects in the room today. They enjoyed the luxury, I enjoyed the luxury of doing new constructions. I think your generation, that's going to be a 25-75% ratio. I think the future of architecture, and if you discuss space, this thinking about reuse of the space as you find it, and kind of revealing its potential and taking the care into it, and even discussing, whether it's minimal or more articulated. It's probably much of our architectural profession is going to be there. So in that sense, if we discuss space, we should really start to take care of this idea of reuse and time related to that as well into the debate. It really adds a different dimension to the thinking about space, I think, inevitably.
I think this is a very important aspect. If we remember this afternoon, this Belgian project with a farm building, it was not at all not at all fit for the use they needed it. And with some intelligence, you just change it. It's a kind of evolution. And then you can use it totally different, and you have very special spaces. They were never been before. And you can change it again inside this glass house. And it's the same with La Caton Vassal. They change rooms or spaces totally with very few, but just with thinking and not very much efforts.
Everything is true, but you cannot plan it. It's a wonderful project, but if you go tomorrow in your office and make a new project, you need something to start a new project. And for that, you cannot know what is in 50 years or in 100 years. You must have, I'm an architect, what can I do? It's wonderful that you didn't destroy that building, that we can reuse it, everything's okay. I'm completely with you. When I have something to say in architecture, I would say it's forbidden to demolish building by law. You have to do something with that, Jan, what you said. Everything exists. So, and to demolish is forbidden. You must find and you must work with everything that is existing. It's clear. It's absolutely clear. Absolutely clear. You can do it very well as you can do it awful. In Berlin is a lot of awful reused buildings and everything, but demolishing. But you cannot plan that tomorrow morning when you have a new project. You have the greenery and everything is free, like you're a wonderful building there. You look at the morning, it's green, and then we have to decide what we do for the next 300 years. And then we are on the question, which kind of space we want, as big as possible, and in what kind of construction, with a construction that never burns. We hope.
Well, I think the material is not the important, and I like the idea we did not really stress, which Simon introduced. This is there are cities, and all our built structure is also bearing our culture, our history. And so this is to answer why a building, so a contribution to the city, at the first moment is thought for, well, long-lasting. Because otherwise it wouldn't be possible. So if I imagine our cities to be reconstructed every 20 years entirely, it would be quite strange. No one would feel at home in those cities. And this is why I liked your project, because you were thinking, or you were talking about how this park came into being, and then later on it had been totally, well, I say reappropriated, transformed, so you saw a new quality in it, and then you made a project which linked those two, well, strings of history to a new project, to a new situation, at least in your situation. And so this is why I like the project, and I think it will be a long-lasting project. It's not so bad. And so I think it's not very important whether it's made of brick or, well, it could have been even made of wood. I don't fear every wooden building burning. So if it sometimes will happen, it would be nice. It is an opportunity for new architects. It's good. and I liked, at least, yeah. And I especially like those buildings made of wood, which seems to be stonework. We saw it in in your project, no, I think it was in, I don't know, in the museum project, no, it was in yours. No? The architrave in wood, it was nice.
I was just, something happened after, after late middle 20th century, where modernism and the welfare state, and I guess after the war, and a sense of responsibility meant that the past had to be erased in the spirit of modernism, as it were, late modernism. And then at some point we lost, modernism failed, and I miss a piece out. So in that process, so much of, say, London and Manchester and cities got destroyed, not because they couldn't be reused, but because culturally, the dysentery, the poverty, the various ill health and demeaning experience that was associated with the terraced house meant that in the mid to late 20th century, you couldn't possibly argue for its retention. But then modernism fails. I don't mean we would all agree it does, but in the eyes of society, modernism fails, and all of a sudden the terraced house is a precious commodity which can be completely re-understood and reused. And now, most living people wouldn't even understand the history that had previously been associated, the negativity that went with vast swathes of European cities. So it's got nothing to do with the buildings, but everything to do with the things that actually happened in the buildings. The kind of the memories, the histories, to use the word monumentality is not quite right, but I'm thinking of Riegel's essay on the monument, where of course things are perceived as things are made as monuments, things acquire monumental value because of the events that occurred. Well, also things take on the inverse of the monument because of the things that happened there. But now we've forgotten, and it's okay again.
So while the rain is finally coming down, we're realizing that our discussion is drifting away from space every now and then. So Jasper Zwiefel has the wonderful task to say the last few words, and I would like to thank everybody who came here, and especially you for the discussion. That was great. Jasper.
Okay. Well, I mean, the discussion continues tomorrow, so even if we drift off today, there's, I guess, much more drifting off tomorrow. So just one thought that occurred to me is that obviously whenever you pick up these like huge topics, as space or the other ones that we have like function and so on, obviously it's also quite clear that there's something much more specific, that needs to be discussed, like adaptation, like typology, all of these things. But maybe it's a good format, to bring this up. I know you won't discuss typology because you told me what will be the next two sort of conferences, but maybe, I mean, that would be a totally different approach to this kind of discussion, and that would also be, I think, really beneficial to everyone, if we had that kind of discussion on, these more specific tasks and how do we deal with these issues. But for today, I'd say we had a vast overview on things related to space in one way or another, and I see a bit of blue sky out there as well. So I guess we call it a day. Thanks everyone. See you back here tomorrow. Have a nice evening. Goodbye.